we can be here today, and hopefully we can have a really good conversation, and there'll be something valuable for you in learning how Ofcom regulates the BBC. For the benefit of the audience, my name is Ali-Abbas Ali. I'm one of the directors in our broadcast and online content team. My portfolio spans media competition and media plurality. And I'm joined by two of the principals in our team, and they're the ones who really do all of the work. So you've got the true experts around the table today. Jonathan, do you want to start just by introducing yourself, please?
Thanks, Ali. It's very flattering of you, expert. So I'm Jonathan. I look after sort of BBC competition assessments we do, which we can talk you through in a little bit. And also I sort of direct projects on wider public service broadcasting in terms of changes that all the public service broadcasters are looking at across the UK ecology. So I have a wider role there as well. Hazel?
Hi, I'm Hazel. I work on BBC competition regulation as well. I'm currently working on how we update our competition guidance and looking more widely at updating competition regulation. And I also work on competition assessments, and I'll talk about some of that in the presentation.
Very good. So if it's okay, Jonathan, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, so Hazel, if you move to the next slide, thank you. I think in this presentation, we plan to take you through these three sort of main areas, just to give you some background on our regulation of the BBC, what our main areas of regulation are, and then we'll talk about our current regulatory framework for assessing BBC's competition, and then try and lighten that with some case studies around these areas. But before we get into detail, I thought it'd be useful to provide you with some initial context on the market position of the BBC in the United Kingdom and the wider world. I think, as you'll all be aware, the BBC occupies a unique position in British national life. I can't think of any other national institution that is embedded so deeply into the fabric of Britain. And I also think you'd be hard pressed, if you find it very difficult to identify another British brand that resonates so strongly across the world in terms of its cultural force and impact. And as you also might know, last year the BBC celebrated its 100th year birthday. And increasingly, as the BBC gets older and the media landscape around it changes quite fundamentally, the debate tends to get louder as to what the role and the scale of the BBC should be, and including how it best should be funded. I think when the BBC first started back in the 1920s, its purpose was really to bring UK radio broadcasting together. And I think at the very beginning, I looked this up, and it only had 4 employees. Now, fast forward to today, the BBC has over 20,000 employees. It has 9 UK-wide TV channels and 55 radio stations, including 39 local radio stations across England. And obviously it also has a range now of online services, such as the popular iPlayer, which we'll talk more about shortly, that shows on-demand television content, and also BBC Sounds, which is the audio streaming equivalent. And there's the BBC News website and the app, and BBC News Online reaches more than 75% of the UK population, and much more internationally. And there's also BBC Education and Learning resources online. So in UK terms, the BBC is a big intervention in the market. Its public funding in sterling was £3.7 billion last year, supplemented by some commercial income of around £140 million of a dividend from the commercial production and distribution. So it contributes significant value to the UK's creative economy. It remains the biggest commissioner of UK content in the domestic market, although commercial PSB public service broadcasters are not too far behind now, and international groups are committing more levels of investment into UK productions. But because of the BBC's public service remit, its mission in public services, the BBC is required to invest in new UK-made creative talent and ideas, and the license fee, the public funding, enables the BBC to do this at scale. So the BBC can help the market, it can spur market growth. So when it performs well, commercial providers, competitors raise their game. So and that's very useful for audiences. Generally, quality improves. And BBC investment can also help catalyze new markets, such as when the iPlayer was first launched, it helped develop a video on demand market. But of course, there's the flip side, and the BBC, while it needs to serve all audiences, all license fee payers, it also needs to be sensitive to commercial sort of operators who operate in the UK market. And our role is to ensure competition concerns are properly considered. The last thing I want to talk about before we go into our regulation, you'll all be aware that there's been a seismic change in the market, in the global market, media market in the last decade in particular. So while the BBC is very big in the domestic market, the BBC itself is at pains and points out to us very often that it is relatively small in relation to some of the global giants nowadays that compete for audiences in the media world, like Google, like Amazon, Apple, Spotify, Disney now, and Netflix. So in our work, we have to weigh up the market dynamics and the potential competitive impact at these different levels of the BBC's activities, so local, national, and international. So that's just a scene setter, but if we move on to the next slide, then I think Hazel is going to take you through our background to our regulation.
Yeah, so we have three different roles set out under the BBC Charter Agreement. So the BBC Charter Agreement came in 2017, and that's what gave us our regulatory role. And our three main duties are, the first one is that we are responsible for ensuring that BBC is delivering for audiences, and that we hold the BBC to account for fulfilling its mission and promoting the public purposes. So its mission, the BBC's mission and public purposes, essentially sets out what the BBC is supposed to do as an organisation. So they cover things like providing news, impartial news, educational services, alongside entertainment. So that's the mission and public purposes. How do we ensure that? Well, we have an operating licence, and that operating licence sets out what we expect the BBC to deliver. At the moment, that sets out a range of quotas for things like the number of hours it provides of programming, such as religious programming, news, current affairs, and also things about where it makes those programmes. The other thing we do is we do an annual report, and that annual report assesses how the BBC is performing in delivering its mission and public purposes. So that's the first part of our role. A second part of our role is regulating the BBC's editorial standards and complaints. So the BBC needs to make sure that it complies with broadcasting code, and if audiences think that they've seen something that breaches that code, so something that's offensive, or maybe that something's not impartial in terms of news, then they can complain to the BBC, and we monitor how the BBC is responding to those complaints. If the complainant isn't satisfied with the BBC's response, then it can be escalated to us for us to consider as well. So that's the second role. And then our third role, and the one we're here to talk about today, is that our role in protecting fair and effective competition. So under the Charter and Agreement, this is really important, the BBC itself must consider its potential impacts on competition. So the BBC has a role there, but we also have a role to ensure that fair and effective competition is protected in the areas where the BBC operates. So that's audio, AV, and also within the news market. So we both have obligations to consider the BBC's impacts on competition. We also have another duty in relation to competition, which we're not going to really discuss in this presentation, but we thought was useful just for completeness to explain it. So the BBC also has commercial interests, mostly sitting under BBC Studios, and we have a role in ensuring those commercial activities don't gain an unfair advantage as a result of their relationship with the BBC Public Service, so the bit that's funded by the licence fee. So we also have that role as well. But again, we won't talk about that too much in this presentation. So why do we regulate BBC competition? Well, Jonathan's touched on this a bit. The BBC is a significant market intervention, and it's not a market failure intervention either. It operates in markets where there are commercial rivals. It provides things that other commercial competitors do provide within the market, albeit that the BBC's offer should be distinctive. So our role is to ensure that BBC public services do not have an adverse impact on competition, which isn't justified by the additional public value that the change provides. So essentially, the BBC can have an impact on the market and does have an impact on the market, but that impact should be justified by that public value that it brings. So the bit extra that it's bringing to the market. When we think about competition, one of our main competition concerns is crowding out. So that means that the BBC makes a change to its service or has an ongoing service that is forcing rival commercial competitors to either reduce their investment in the market or to exit the market altogether. And that's a concern for us because that would reduce choice or quality or innovation for audiences. And when we think about regulation at Ofcom, the key thing we want to think about is how audiences are served. So we think where crowding out occurs, where the BBC is pushing rivals out of the market, that is where we start to be concerned, because we recognise that audiences will suffer from reduced choice or quality. I think Jonathan touched on where the BBC sits in the market. Obviously, it's quite a big player in the UK market, but within the global market, it's dwarfed compared to some of its international competitors. And when we think about crowding out, we tend to think about the impact on domestic competitors rather than large global competitors. And that's partly because we don't think the BBC is likely to have a huge impact on global competitors, partly because of their size, but also because global competitors will make their decisions at a global level when they think about strategy, whereas obviously a UK competitor is much more likely to think about the UK market and therefore more likely to be impacted by BBC choices. So what does regulation look like in practice? All right, this is quite a complicated diagram. It was supposed to come up as an animation to make life a bit easier, but unfortunately I don't think that's going to work on Zoom. So this sets out our role and the BBC's role, and you'll notice the BBC has quite a significant role actually in this process. So I'll explain their role and then how we fit in as well. So when the BBC decides to make a change, the first thing the BBC needs to do is decide whether that change is going to be a material change. And a material change can mean two things. A material change could be a new UK public service. So for instance, if the BBC decides to launch a new radio station, that would automatically be a material change. The other time we might get a material change is where the change may have a significant impact on adverse impact on competition. So that happens, that's an assessment on competition, on the competition that needs to be made, on the competition impact that needs to be made. If the BBC decide a change is not material, then they are free to implement that change effectively. But Ofcom does have a step-in role. So if we disagree with the BBC's assessment, if we think the change is material, we can step in and order the BBC to undertake a public interest test. If the BBC itself decides the change is material, the same thing happens. It needs to undertake a public interest test. A public interest test is used to determine whether the competition impacts of the change they're making are justified by the public value. So this is where we start thinking about both what the competition impact is likely to be, but also what the public value is likely to be. And we need to decide whether it's justified by the public value. Now, the materiality assessment is quite a light touch stage. It tends to be done using information that the BBC already holds. They will sort of use internal data to predict what the likely impact is to be on the market. They might talk to stakeholders, but it would be a light touch engagement process. Once we get to a public interest test, it's a much more involved process. So there will be a formal consultation held by the BBC. They will undertake an economic analysis of the impact. They'll probably use research to back that up. So they might talk to audiences about changes in behaviour, and they'll also look at the public value. And again, that might involve some additional research on their behalf. So a public interest test takes between about 6 and 9 months. So it's quite a significant piece of work. Once the BBC has finished its public interest test, that's when Ofcom's role starts. So once the BBC has finished its public interest test, it will publish that, and then we take on our role, which is normally a BBC competition assessment. And the BBC competition assessment is to determine if the competition impacts are justified by the public value. So we're using the same tests as the BBC, and we will look at the work they've done, their economic analysis to understand the competition impacts and decide whether we are satisfied by that. We will also look at their public value assessment and consider that. So we may do our own economic analysis, or we may rely on the BBC's, but we'll certainly look at that. And we will also assess their public value assessment. And we take about 3-4 months to do that generally. And at the end of that, we have 4 options. So if we're completely satisfied by everything and we're happy that the competition impacts are justified by the public value, then the BBC is free to implement that change. If we have any concerns, then we can direct the BBC to redo a PIT. Now, that's quite a nuclear option and would really be if we were very unsatisfied with what the BBC had done in terms of their public interest test, and we've never done that. We can approve the change with conditions. So we can put conditions on what the BBC to do to maybe limit how far they can take the changes, or maybe to ensure that we can monitor any impact. So we can do that, and we have done that in the past. Or we can just completely block the change. So if we think there's no way that the public value is ever going to justify the competition impact, then we could just simply block a change. Again, quite a nuclear option, never done that. That's all about changes the BBC is going to make to its services, but we do have a further power called the BBC Competition Review Power. And this is a power that we can use on where an activity is ongoing. So obviously the BBC's position in the market will change, the market changes rapidly, their services evolve over time. If we're concerned that the BBC's impact in an area of the market is causing an issue and isn't justified by the public value, we can undertake a BBC competition review. We've never undertaken one, but we have thought about it, and we'll talk a bit more about that later on. So I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan now to talk about the BBC's plans to expand iPlayer and our role in that.
Thanks, Hazel. So to bring this presentation to life a little, we thought we'd a little more. We thought we'd take you through a few case studies to demonstrate how we applied our rules in practice. So this first one is in relation to the BBC's plans to develop its video streaming on-demand service, the BBC iPlayer. I think you'll probably have heard of the iPlayer. It's central to the BBC's digital strategy of reaching all audiences across all platforms. It's popular. It's popular. It's a high-quality service. It has around 20% share of the video on-demand market in the UK. So greater than all the other commercial PSBs combined, PSB public service broadcasters share combined. However, in terms of video on-demand viewing audiences, iPlayer has still some way to go to catch up with the most popular sort of on-demand viewing in the UK. That's Netflix, and for younger audiences in particular. I think last year, 25% of 16 to 34-year-olds, that's younger adults in our parlance in the UK, watched the iPlayer each week, compared to around over half, 55% of 16 to 34-year-olds for Netflix. And also there are newer entrants in the market, such as Disney Plus, who are catching up fast with the iPlayer's viewing. So in 2018, the BBC came to us, came to Ofcom with a proposal to extend the period in which a program can be viewed on iPlayer. Usually, programs are put on the iPlayer for around 30 days. That's the window. But the BBC wanted to extend that window, how long it was on iPlayer, from 28 days, 30 days to a year in most cases. And that would put the BBC more in line with services such as Netflix. And Netflix themselves sometimes carry BBC content when BBC sell it to Netflix, and that's up there for a year. So BBC wanted also to extend the window. And the BBC also wanted to move quickly with this proposal. And its initial assessment, as Hazel was talking about the process, when the BBC assessed materiality, if it was going to have an impact on competition, they concluded that it was not material, this change they wanted to do. And therefore, they wanted to make the change immediately and not have to conduct a public interest test, and for us not to conduct a full formal BBC competition assessment. However, we took a different view. After carefully assessing the BBC's plans, we disagreed with the BBC's conclusions. We considered that the proposed change was a material change, and therefore we, as Hazel talked around, we directed the BBC to do a public interest test. And we felt this process, there was a lot of stakeholder interest in the iPlayer, and we felt this process would ensure that any legitimate competition concerns and the potential market impacts were fully considered by the BBC alongside the public value benefits. Now, as the slide says, normally when we direct the BBC to do a pit, the BBC would also tell the BBC to stop making changes to the iPlayer until after the completion of the public interest test, and only when our final approval had been given if we were to approve it. However, in this case, we believed it was appropriate to allow the BBC to make some changes, some limited changes, to extend some of the viewing window for a year for some programmes they had rights for, because we did understand there is a need for the BBC to continue to develop the iPlayer and for the BBC to retain audiences. So rather than wait 9 months to a year for the full competition process to conclude. So they started the process, and in the event, following the conclusion of our formal competition process, we concluded that the proposed changes could go ahead, but we had certain conditions attached to sort of mitigate the risk to fair and effective competition, as FEC on the slide. So we imposed reporting requirements to monitor the impact of the proposals, and required the BBC to collect data on how the BBC iPlayer was performing against certain categories of content and against certain audience demographics. So that was the case study on the iPlayer. If Hazel, if you want to move on to the next slide. So this next slide, this is around where this is supposed to be animation, but this is the next case study. If you move on to the next one, Hazel, the next slide is around BBC Three, and this is to quickly talk you through a case study where both the BBC and us agreed with each other that the changes the BBC wanted to make were indeed material, so they may have a significant adverse impact on competition. I mean, to be fair, it would have been impossible for us to disagree with each other in this case, as it concerned the introduction of a new TV service, which is the channel for younger audiences, BBC Three, the television channel. And under the BBC Charter, as Hazel said, if the BBC wanted to introduce a new service, it automatically is considered a material change. So the BBC must conduct a public interest test, and we must conduct a competition assessment before the change can proceed. Now, when I say BBC Three was a new service, BBC Three had somewhat of a sort of tortuous history in the BBC, because it was initially introduced as a new service back in 2003 as a broadcast TV channel, which was aimed specifically at younger audiences. And it ran as a broadcast channel for around 13 years initially, and had quite a few successful shows. It was never really had big audiences, but it was doing okay for the audience. But in 2015, the BBC announced that BBC Three would become digital online only. And the main reason for this was the BBC needed to save money. At the time, the BBC felt that BBC Three could be shut as a linear service, a TV service, broadcast service, which would save them around £30 million to stop broadcasting. And they felt it was okay to do it with BBC Three because younger audiences were generally going to online viewing much quicker than the older audiences. However, a few years later, the BBC, in its wisdom, commissioned new research, and it showed that there is still a market for young people on broadcast TV. And the BBC still needed to attract younger audiences, so they submitted proposals to relaunch the channel as the BBC Three as a channel, and therefore we had to do a competition assessment. And again, as Hazel referred to, our main competition concern is the crowding out. And this is the idea that BBC Three potentially was taking a valuable audience, that's 16 to 34-year-olds, away from commercial broadcasters to such an extent that it significantly affects their revenues, their advertising revenues and profits. And ultimately, this is bad for audiences because it might reduce audience choice and the quality of provision in the market. So we conducted an assessment, and Hazel, if you move on, thank you. So to sum up, I won't talk you through this slide too much because I'm conscious of time, but to sum it up, the figures here show that from our market impact analysis, we concluded that BBC Three would account, coming back to broadcast, would account for a very small share of TV viewing. That's just 1.5% of this sort of viewing share. And I think actually the latest figures, that was an estimate by us of analysis, but the latest figures for last year showed that I think BBC Three is getting a share of less than 1%. So it's smaller than even we projected, and even amongst the 16 to 34-year-olds, the key demographic, it's not much higher than 1% share. So as such, we concluded it would have a relatively small impact on viewing to the competitor channels, and therefore would be unlikely to significantly affect their levels of investment as a table and the impact on advertising revenues. But we did agree that the BBC that the new channel would demonstrate public value. It provided targeted content for an underserved audiences, that's younger audience, which are critical to the future of the BBC. BBC really needs to have younger audiences watch their content, and this public value justified the relatively small market impact that it would have resulted. So that's the BBC Three case study. Hazel, I think it's over to you now. Next one. You're on mute.
No. And now I'm mute.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a case where the BBC found a change was not material and went ahead and undertook that change because we agreed that it also was not material. Okay, so this is a change that the BBC was going to make to its online local news. So the BBC has been looking more widely about its provision of news and local services and looking at how it might change those and adapt those to meet changing audience needs. So the BBC recognised that audiences are moving online and they're looking to move some of their provision online. And this is part of a wider programme, but one of the things they wanted to do was do some more local news online. So they were going to invest more money in producing more stories on their local pages for local audiences. So in September 2022, the BBC undertook a materiality assessment to look at those proposals. What the BBC needed to do with that materiality assessment was decide whether what they were proposing might have an adverse impact on fair and effective competition. So they don't need to look at the public value at this stage, they just need to understand whether there's any chance that it will have an adverse impact on fair and effective competition. And this is the BBC's role. So the BBC undertook some analysis to look at the potential uplift on to page views on their website as a consequence of them putting more local news stories on the website. So they used figures from previous additional stories to work out what likely number of views news stories on those local pages might have, and then they used that to look at how many page views that was likely to take from rival publishers in terms of loss of page views, and then from that to look at the financial impact on those news publishers. They also engaged with representatives of news publishers to talk to them about what the potential impact might be. So they took into account some of the information that those representatives gave them. And as a result of that materiality assessment, they decided that their proposals were not material. So they decided that they didn't think they would have an adverse impact on fair and effective competition. Now, there is no official role for the Ofcom in this process other than for us to step in and say we disagree. But in reality, what happens is the BBC will send us their materiality assessment. That's because they don't want to go ahead with the change only for us to come in and step in at a later date and say, actually, we think that's material, you need to stop that and you need to go back and do a public interest test. And for us, it means we can see what the BBC is doing and how it's thinking about its materiality assessment. So it gives us some assurance as well. So the BBC will send us its materiality assessment, and we will look at that and consider it to make sure that we're satisfied that they've come to the right conclusion. So as with other competition assessments, our main concern was around crowding out of commercial local news websites here. And it was the main concern of those commercial representatives as well. So a lot of the representatives of the news publishers came to us and with concerns about the changes, and also provided us with additional information that they thought had not been assessed by the BBC. Now, when we looked at the BBC's materiality assessment, we thought in some areas their view was too narrow. So there were a couple of areas where we thought that. We thought that some of the things they hadn't included in the materiality assessment because they didn't think it fell within this materiality assessment should have been included. And we also thought that the BBC had taken a narrow view of what the impacts could be, and they could have done some more scenario testing around what the actual impacts could be. So as a result of that, we did some work ourselves in terms of economic analysis, looking at the potential impact of the proposals, and we tested particularly around a range of scenarios about what the diversion rates might be from local news publishers. So about how many page views they were likely to lose as a result of BBC having more stories online. And from that, we also looked at the potential impact on revenues. The other thing we considered, which the BBC hadn't looked at in any detail, was how close the BBC's offer was to what was already within the commercial market. So we thought about how distinctive what the BBC would offer might be, and whether that might limit its impact because maybe what the BBC offered wasn't substitutional for what the commercial local news websites were offering. So we also considered that. We agreed with the BBC. We didn't think that the change was likely to have adverse impact on fair and effective competition. But we also recognised there was quite a bit of uncertainty around this particular change. This isn't an area where we have great data in terms of local news. There isn't a huge amount about how audiences engage with local news, their preferences, or a huge amount of information about the uptake of web views and things like that. We haven't got great information. So one of the things we said is this is an area where we'll do some further monitoring and some further work. So we are looking at the moment about how we monitor that and how we understand how the changes to the BBC website impact local commercial providers. The other case study I'm going to talk about is where a service is ongoing. So this is where we have the BBC competition review power, which allows us to look at ongoing services, and if we think there's an issue, to decide whether the competition impact is justified by the public value. So in this case, the service we're looking at is BBC Sounds. Now, I thought I'd just explain bit about BBC Sounds because I think it's a fairly unique service. So BBC Sounds brings together all of BBC's audio services. So that's all of its live radio stations. So that goes from national radio stations like Radio 1 and Radio 2 to local news local stations as well. So you can pick up all the local radio stations. You can also catch up. So there is, you can catch up on radio programs that you've missed. So there's an on-demand service. Most of those programs stay on there for 30 days. There's also podcasts, which the BBC produces, which are available on BBC Sounds and often more widely on podcast platforms as well. And then they also have something called music mixes, which is kind of streams of music, a bit like Spotify, but you can't skip tracks or move to particular tracks within those streams. So it's quite a mix of things, and it's quite a big platform, and it is quite a used platform in the UK as well, and it's available on a range of devices, so you can pick it up on your smartphones, your tablets, but it's also within car audio systems, so you can use it within your car in the UK, which is quite important when it comes to audio listening. So BBC Sounds sits within a really fast changing market. I think linear radio has held up a bit better than linear TV in the UK market, but we are starting to see quite a shift, particularly with entrants like Spotify, so people spending much more time streaming music, particularly younger audiences. BBC Sounds was launched to replace BBC Radio iPlayer, which was a similar-ish service, but BBC Sounds has a few additional extras. And since the BBC's launched it, it's made quite a lot of incremental changes. Like most sort of online platforms, there are always tweaks and additional functionality being added and things like that. So it's changed quite a bit since its launch. And the commercial radio sector has been really concerned about the impact of BBC Sounds and the impact of all these changes into making it into a more successful and perhaps more impactful service. So as a result, we decided we wanted to take a look at BBC Sounds, take a look at its position in the market, and also to think about whether we needed to launch a BBC competition review. This was quite an involved process. So we started off with a call for evidence, and that allowed us to identify our 3 theories of harm. I'm only going to talk about one because they're quite complicated, but we identified 3 theories of harm. We then undertook a comprehensive analysis of the market using market data. We've got a fantastic research team here at Ofcom, and they provided a lot of our data in terms of both data about listening, which we get through Radar in the UK, but also data about audience use as well, so audience surveys. And then the economists used that to underpin our economic analysis. And they did a detailed economic analysis to look at the 3 theories of harm. And finally, once we'd done all that, we consulted with stakeholders on our analysis. They provided us additional data, which we also considered in our final decision. So our main theory of harm, surprise, surprise, was around crowding out and the idea that BBC Sounds might be crowding out commercial competitors who provide online audio in the UK. So those are mainly radio providers. So there's 3 sort of big radio companies in the UK who all provide online radio. And we didn't think we had reasonable grounds to believe that the BBC was having a significant adverse effect on fair and effective competition. And the reason for that is actually because commercial radio is simply doing much better than BBC Sounds in the market. And I don't know how easy it's going to be for you to see these graphs, but essentially, if we look at the one on the left, that shows the average weekly reach for live radio through online platforms. And what you can see is the purple is the BBC and the green is commercial. And you can see that commercial is running away from the BBC, essentially. Their reach is going up and up, and the BBC's is staying fairly flat, despite the introduction of BBC Sounds. And on the right, you get a similar thing. This is also looking at share of online radio listening. And again, you can see that the BBC's share in purple has just been gradually tapering down, while commercial share has been increasing. So essentially, we've satisfied that the BBC is not having an adverse impact on fair and effective competition. In fact, the commercial services are doing really rather well. And so that was our conclusion. which we published a couple of years ago. We've since gone on to take another look at the audio market as part of our recent work, and the pattern remains the same, essentially. Commercial radio is still doing really well in the online market. So these are all the things we've done in the past, but what about the future? So we are just about halfway through the BBC Charter, and there has been a lot of talk about what the future might be for the next charter. But there's been a lot of change even in the past 5 years in terms of the BBC's position in the market. We're still seeing more competition for audiences. Since the charter began, we've had the launch of seen Netflix grow in the market, and we've seen SVODs generally grow, but we've had the launch of new SVODs like Disney Plus as well. So there's a lot more competition for audiences even since the beginning of the charter. We've seen changes in audience behaviour. So obviously we were seeing more people moving online, but the pandemic seems to have accelerated that. And not only is that younger audiences, we're definitely seeing older audiences using more online services now, moving into using VOD. And for the BBC in particular, there's been budgetary pressures. So the government froze its licence fee, which means it has a hole in its budget, essentially, particularly in a high inflationary environment in the UK. That's really causing a pinch. So the BBC needs to transform its services. It needs to meet those challenges. It needs to go where audience is going. So it needs to modernise its services. It needs to develop its digital services. And it needs to do that with less money, which is always makes life more difficult. And I guess our role is not to be in the way of the BBC transforming and modernising its services. So we had a look at how our regulation was working. The government is also looking at that as part of its what we call a mid-term review halfway through the charter. We have made suggestions to government to update our competition framework to give us the more flexibility to allow the BBC to make changes where we think the competition impacts would be limited more quickly. We're also publishing a new operating licence, and that operating licence is going to move away from kind of the more prescriptive quotas and requirements that we have in place at the moment to something that will give the BBC more flexibility in how it delivers its mission and public purposes. But alongside that, we'll need the BBC to be more transparent about reporting how it will meet those mission and public purposes. The other thing about that operating licence is we'll bring in the online services, which at the moment aren't really covered by the operating licence. So it will be a more holistic licence that covers everything the BBC does. So that's the future. I think that's it.
Masako, that's us done for the presentation material. I realised there was a lot in there and a lot to take in. So very happy to take any questions from the floor or to pick up any of the themes that you found particularly interesting.
Yes, thank you so